Well, look who we have here. I'm ever so glad you could make it back to sit around by the fire with me today, friend. As you well know, last episode we created something of a safe haven for the fine folks of this region to come and stay in our nice inn. A place where weary travelers can get themselves a cozy bed for a night or two and even a hot bowl of stew. We also built some nice little areas for people to rent out for long-term use. And towards the end of the episode, we ended up taking two barbarians prisoner when they showed up in a much larger group and attempted to kill us. But even after the sins that they've committed against us, I still feel quite sorrowful for their conditions and their lodgings, and thus because of that, the first order of business today is going to be to build a proper prison for them. Even after they're recruited, we plan on using this new little area here as some residential housing for our slaves and also a few of our new employees, but the construction would be halted when we had some very pissed off insectoids who were trying to kill us. It seems that Tadashi was attempting to eat some of their jelly or something, and they didn't like that, but after a little bit of time and elbow grease, we ended up killing them. As we were getting back into the swing of construction, we had also finally enslaved the barbarian known as Urist. Needless to say, she was none too tickled about being enslaved by us, and also of course she wasn't happy because she was still recovering from the beating that we had gave her, but we'll be happy to have her constructive knowledge for our projects. A bit of time later, we also had a 43-year-old lady by the name of Clara offering to come and rent out one of our fine cottages, which of course we quickly accepted for a decent price. She seemed to be quite happy and grateful for her new lodgings and a new home. After sawing some more wood into planks as needed for the wooden flooring as well as the doors that we're building in our little prison here, we would eventually end up finishing the construction. And we were pretty pleased with how it turned out. Now you may notice that these rooms are kinda small, but the reason that I'm making these rooms so small is to, of course, not to use up too many of our resources, but also because the winters can be quite chilly. The smaller the space, the less it takes to heat a room, and thus why we only have torches. Our new tenant Clara at one point was enjoying her stay here so much that she actually offered to join us as an employee. Not only would she be able to work here and eat our food for free now, but she would also be able to work for us and pay it off, so I guess it's not free. Anyway, we accepted. By this point, we were also getting some pretty good size yields of raw hide, which also made me think we should probably go about expanding our little gardening space here where we're growing rice and now also some potatoes. But the reason that the leather made me think of it is because we could also go about growing plenty of cotton plants. Since hunting down wild game, butchering and cleaning them and then drying out their hide is an extensive and tedious process, getting some cotton and then spinning it into cloth would be a much more efficient solution, I suppose you could say. Currently, our diets consist of nothing but rice, wild berries, and some wild game, so to add on to our different supplies of food, we would also start plenty of fishing by the river. Every little bit counts, especially when beginning to prep for winter once more. Near our little garden where we've been growing all of our rice, we also decided to set up a proper workshop where we can begin sawing our timber into some planks. Previously, I think I was using some type of workbench when realistically I should have been using a trestle, I believe it was, and now that we have two of them, we can easily and very efficiently cut plenty of planks, which are quite crucial to our construction projects. We also had some wild boars in the area, which Urist would actually attempt to begin taming, and she was quite successful with the first of which. Now, this might seem a little odd, but we are running the Rotten Boar Inn, so it only felt fitting that we have some proper animals going along with our little business. And also, we could go about raising them, breeding them, and then slaughtering them for food. Or even perhaps we could train them to be some type of war pigs, maybe slap some chainmail on them and send them into battle, who knows. Speaking of which, it would seem that some of the members from House Hess have come to attack us. I suppose not everyone is in favor of the idea of a safe inn out here in the forest where travelers can stay. If you ask me, I think that Hess is no better than the damn bandits that roam these lands and rob folk. folks. And that's exactly why we had no issue using our bow and arrows to slaughter as many of them as humanly possible, as well as some of them stepping on our spike traps, of course. With the majority of their forces defeated, one of them would attempt to run away, and we did shoot at them for a moment, but we didn't decide to chase after them, unfortunately. We had sympathy for some desperate folks like bandits, but House Hess, we would never have any pity for a damn oligarchy like this. Their kingdom does not rob people out of desperation. Our young squire, Dial, or Dill, or however you want to pronounce it, is now an adult. The young lad has really blossomed into puberty with a scratchy voice and what have you. Nevertheless, we decided to equip him with some of the armor that we took from the soldiers of House Hess. The young lad, as a young adult, still wasn't all that great at most skill sets, but we would let him saw plenty of timber, and with his new bill hook, he could actually try to protect the place along with Tadashi. I myself would end up taking one of their fine iron shields along with a nice sturdy morning star and a beautiful bandana upon my head, now protecting my tender little forehead from the elements. Now then, back to business. In this little forest here, we do still have plenty of old ancient structures, or at least some fairly old structures that nobody's using anymore since we're the only ones that own this area, and thus because of that we are going to be tearing down these buildings, or at least what's left of them, for their precious stone materials. We plan on using these new resources to begin replacing the portions of our wooden spike fencing with some proper stone castle walls. Needless to say, but I'll go ahead and say it anyways, these stone walls are going to be much more durable and thus protect us much better, as well as our clientele. Speaking of which, we have yet another tenant who is offering us 300 silver in total, unless they decide that they like it here and also decide to renew their tenancy with us, who is going to be joining us. After this point, I probably won't continue mentioning every single tenant until we have a bunch of them, I might show you. But anywho, for a while we would continue replacing our wooden spike fencing with the castle walls as previously mentioned, but then I ended up noticing something. It would appear that our inn has become so popular to weary travelers that we don't currently have enough beds, and we actually have some people who are sleeping on the floors. Not only do we not have enough beds, but it would also seem that the beds that we do currently have to rent out for a night are a little bit too expensive for some of our less fortunate folks. So we began to come up with a plan to take care of this little issue, during which time we actually had the barbarian known as Dorsey, who attacked us last episode as well, who joined us as one of our employees, which was absolutely perfect as he could help us in our construction efforts of a brand new camp for people to rent out tents for a night. Obviously, tents are less than ideal when compared to some proper rooms in the inn, but we don't currently have all that much room, and do we really want to charge 10 silver per night for a bedroom? Probably not. So to me personally, this seems like more than an adequate alternative. Besides, it sure as shit beats sleeping outside of a tent on the ground. Over at our tannery building, we actually began building something of a small little porch, I suppose you could call, onto the front of it, where we're going to put our looms and also a tailoring bench. Now, I am well aware that there is a work speed debuff, you could call it, for having these outside, but I thought it was very fitting with our aesthetic as we are still up and coming. But as we continue moving up in the world from a business standpoint, our clientele seems to be moving on up as well, as we have some pretty well-known swordsmen who have begun visiting us and renting out some of our rooms and purchasing some meals from us. Of course, we don't plan on turning tail or turning our backs on our less fortunate clientele, but I only bring this up because they are paying a handsome little fee for these things. After many a day of growing, it was finally time for us to go about harvesting our cotton and taking it over to our little textile tanning area to go about turning it into some proper cloth. As of right now, I don't exactly have any projects in mind as to what we'll use this cloth for, although I know with winter and fall coming up, I'm sure we may end up needing some warm clothing. However, we would also end up building yet another structure, though albeit this one very small. This is going to be our little laboratory, our researching room. We're going to be storing books and scrolls of knowledge of old to help us learn a few new technologies. As you probably guessed, the first of which is going to be tailoring, because our tailoring bench as well as our new cloth isn't going to do us any good if we don't know what to do with it. And with this tech, we'll be able to make many a different type of apparel as well as many different types of rugs. Though this extremely useful knowledge cannot be memorized and learned overnight, so we'll check back in on that in a moment. As for right now, we have yet another construction project in mind. This one is going to be specifically more oriented towards our tenants who are renting out our little cottages, but also can be used by anyone, of course. This is going to be a ye olde bathhouse. As you can see, we have 3 wooden tubs. We actually have a stone hot water heater or the medieval equivalent, of course, as well as a boiler that is made out of iron ingots. Pretty crass and rudimentary, yes, but very luxurious for the times. God knows these poor, weary souls could use a proper cleaning. Trying to wash yourself in the river is all well and good until you start getting leeches on you and animal feces, and you know what I'm talking about. With that though, we had finally finished up our extensive research into tailoring, and we would waste absolutely no time using up a little bit of our cloth on some proper rugs. These projects felt quite fitting for our first time sewing anything together, and I must say that they look pretty good. Given the whitish gray contrast with our wooden flooring in the inn, I decided that they would probably look best in some of the rooms and would also make people want to stay there even more so. And speaking of improvements for our inn, while we're at it, I decided to put up some proper signage. Of course, we do have our large wall all around our property here, but once they come in, they'll know what's what. Of course, that does also mean that we'll need to put up some signs for our other areas around the town here, but we'll get around to that later. As for right now, it would seem that we have a defector by the name of Carlson who is offering to join us here as an employee, completely free of charge, except for room and board, of course, so we quickly accepted. The handsome hooded gentleman approached with his hammer drawn. We just assumed that he was ready to knock a few nails into a few logs for us and get right to building, but it turns out that it seems to be his father's, as he was his father's apprentice blacksmith. We found it a bit odd and awkward that he was offering up all these details about himself within the first few moments of meeting him, but okay. As they say out in these parts, you never look a rotten gift boar in the mouth, and that's probably not it, but I digress. Now, Carlson, being the apprentice smith that he was as a child, knows his way around some iron ore, and that's exactly why we decided to have him, as well as a few other of our fine folks, go about mining out a very large vein of it. Having a smith as part of our company is going to be extremely handy, as he'll be able to easily turn this iron ore into iron ingots, and then we can use it for, well, just about anything. However, that does mean that we need to build ourselves a proper blacksmith shop. That way we have the efficient space to go about using these items, as well as crafting new weapons and armor and tools that'll help us cut down trees and dig out stone, and you know. We ended up building this just across the river from our storage depot. That way we have ample access to any other resources that we may need, such as logs and timber and stuff like that are also required for weapons and tools, such as their handles. But as we were going to let Carlson become the new smith of our property here, it would seem that he turned out to be a double agent from the Shining Company. We should have known there would be something fishy about a gentleman who is a blacksmith offering his services for free with no charge at all, with no sob story. Well, kind of a sob story. Anyway, we ended up taking his ass down right there in our city streets. He wasn't unwaveringly loyal to the Shining Company, but we weren't going to recruit him. No, we had to make an example out of this traitor. We would need to make a spectacle for the entire village to see. You may try to kill us, but you never cross us. You pathetic, traitorous worm. Let this be an example to any and all of those who would choose to do the same. Normally, in a situation like this, we would parade his mutilated corpse throughout the streets so that they know all about it, but we don't currently have anyone in the village who hasn't seen it, so we decided to stuff his corpse in a cage instead. And though, yes, it does suck that the blacksmith or possible blacksmith turned out to be a traitor, the show must go on. And so we decided to go about planting a field of flax where our cotton was. That way we'll be able to grow it and spin it into linen once it's grown. So we'll check back in later. As for right now, we're going to begin cutting down plenty of hay grass that's just growing out here in the wild, and we're going to end up making a good little storage pile of it in our hog pen for our boars. As you can see, they are becoming quite plentiful and giving birth quite quickly, so it won't be very long at all before we have plenty to slaughter or to send into battle, whatever we so choose. But even without a smith, we also are going to continue our own blacksmithing, and that's why we have mined out some coal chunks, and we're going to be using those to fuel our gigantic furnace. First things first though, we're going to need to begin smelting and casting some iron ingots. Once we have a good stockpile of those, the true smithing can begin. In the meantime, I noticed that all of our little cottage cabins, or whatever we're calling them now, are already rented out, and thus we need more room for more tenants. Otherwise, we're not going to have enough beds for everyone. So, utilizing the logs and timber that we currently have at our disposal, we immediately began building 3 cozy little cabins out here in the woods. This way we can continue our mission of servicing the people of this fine land, and also continuing to make a bit of money, of course. By this point, our little teeny tiny field of flax was fully grown, and now it was time for us to begin making some linen. Now, linen, of course, is a little bit different from cloth, but we do specifically need it for very certain recreational items that can't be created with cloth, such as a Tarako table, which we would immediately put right in front of our nice warm hearth so our guests could play a few games together, while also filling their bellies with our rice soup and cozying on up together. By this point as well, our village was truly blossoming, but I noticed on our western side, and really all throughout our village, we only have one outhouse, which, as you could imagine, isn't exactly ideal, especially for the new folks who are living in the western area. So we quickly threw together yet another wooden commode in a wooden outhouse down here, hidden by the forest just a little bit, but awfully close to these houses for convenience. Let's just hope that the smell doesn't start to bother them. For our next research project, we are going to begin looking into the technologies of basic cooking. At this point, we've only been creating some simple rice soups for everyone, but with this, there are definitely much more interesting and delicious methods as well as types of food that might just bring in some guests who are more well endowed in their silver sacks. Speaking of silver and sacks and or places to store it, we actually ended up digging out a small little cellar in our inn. That way we can go about storing our riches there. Just a basic wooden hatch. You wouldn't even know it was there if I didn't tell you, and that is the entire point. Inconspicuous. Speaking of storage in our inn, we hopefully will end up having some delicious ale as well as a few other types of drinks, and thus we decided to build a few barrels upstairs near the inn rooms. That way we can store those too. We also threw up a few more defenses just outside our gates. We decided to put up a few wooden spikes, that way just to kind of help us give some cover to ourselves when we're firing our arrows and stuff like that. But most importantly, we actually have this rock box here. A very simple contraption, essentially a wooden box that hangs over our walls, just chock full of rock chunks, and then we drop them on the heads of anyone that gets a little too close. Speaking of which, it would seem that now is the perfect time to test out our new defenses, as we have a very decent sized group of barbarians coming to try to murder us. We would mount our defense out by our new spike traps, taking cover behind them and attempting to fire our arrows as previously mentioned. Thanks to their mounted wildlife, many of our spike traps were not really doing all that much to stop them, so we would retreat back inside of our walls. The bandits would attempt to follow suit, and as we ended up killing one, we realized we had a little bit of an issue. You see, the corpse of this rugged bastard was holding our gate wide open, leaving us vulnerable to the others rushing in on us. We would rush in to move the blockage with arrows and javelins whizzing by our noggins. We slammed our gate right in front front of their faces and began chucking rocks on top of their little heads. After realizing the danger that they were truly in, they began a panic and started rushing all around the area, which was pretty great at first because they began hitting many of our spike traps, killing a few of these foolish members. But with the amount of traps we have beginning to dwindle, it was time for us to join the fray again, slinging open our gates once more, this time in teams of 2. 3 of us would begin beating and brutalizing and mutilating with our melee weapons as the other team were firing over our shoulders with their arrows. This type of ample teamwork was truly a spectacle to behold. And with that, what few couple of these barbarians were left alive, they would manage to flee the area to tell the others as to what happened here today. I'm sure we'll see them again very soon. But as for the few that were remaining within our perimeter, we would end up killing them, except for a few who we actually decided to take as our prisoners, of course. 2 of them will become employees, and another who is unwaveringly loyal will become a slave to us. Thankfully, everyone was safe and sound, and really the only worries that we had were the corpses that were now piling up, as well as a small forest fire, which we managed to handle. We are truly blossoming into something magnificent, my friends. Speaking of our blossoming and awesome community, we have finally finished up our research into basic cooking, which is now going to allow us to cook many of the different types of meals we discussed earlier. Of course, with more advanced forms of cooking, though, that also means we're going to need something other than just a hearth fire. We need some pots and pans and knives and spices and yada yada yada, which of course we kinda have, and thus we began making ourselves some fine meals. Not only are these meals perfect for attracting attention of new clientele, but they also will keep our current tenants very happy and thus keeping them wanting to stay here. As you can see, it actually gives everyone that eats them a good mood buff. So plumb tickled about the prospect of these new fine meals, Sissy decided to throw a party in the inn, which all in the village would attend. It was so nice mingling with one another, kicking back, eating some hearty stews by the fire, playing some games, and just enjoying each other's company. Now that the fun from the party has subsided, it's time for us to get back to business for our next research project. We're going to be working on beer brewing. It only seems fitting that an inn would also let you get yourself warm, not only by hearty stews and by fires, but also by a little bit of alcohol. Since we have such a growing population once more, now that we're working on our research project, in the meantime, we decided to build a few new residential houses. Now, unfortunately, I had initially wanted Rin's home up here, his little cottage, to kind of be off by itself, but we are beginning to run out of room, and it also seems like it would make sense that as we continue expanding, his house would be kind of incorporated in the main village. By the time that we finally finished up our new housing, we had also finished up our extensive research into brewing, so naturally the next step was to begin building ourselves a small little brewery here, as you can see, just above our tanning area. Nothing too extravagant, just enough room for us to mash up some wort, as well as going about fermenting it in these here barrels. That way we can have our patrons enjoy it. And also so we can make a little bit of coin off of it, of course. Speaking of which, we also had an elven goods trader that stopped in to, well, do a little bit of trading with us. They were most interested in our weapons, and to be honest with you, we were quite interested in what weapons they had for sale. We would end up purchasing ourselves a couple of finely made crossbows. This will make defending our village from barbarians in the House of Hess that much easier. Not only much more convenient, but also much less strenuous. And with that, my friends, we're getting our very first snowfall of this new year. It's been fall for quite some time, but it would seem that winter is just around the corner once more. And as the icy, gripping winds of winter begins to dwell upon these lands, we can't help but look back and reflect on the past year and just how well that we've done since last winter, and how much that we've expanded not only our population, but our business and village as a whole. Ah yes, truly remarkable, and all the friends that we've made along the way. Some of us, though, are possibly more than friends, it would seem. Ah, yes, it's just as I thought. It would seem that Rin, old boy here, has fallen for our elven companion, who I am going to be calling Null, because I don't feel like pronouncing the full name, but regardless, the two of them are in love. Looks like hearty stews, ale, and fires aren't the only things keeping us warm nowadays. As time passed though, we began to spot a large, mythical creature in the nearby woods by the village. A gigantic dare, a mystical, magical creature that is quite ancient in these woods. Imagine the stories that it could tell. Imagine what it tastes like. That's right, kiddos, we're going on something of a hunting trip. As mentioned, winter is almost here, and though we are doing pretty well at stuffing our slaughterhouse full of wild game, this giant mythical beast would be perfect. With a team effort as a collective, we began firing multiple arrows into this large beast, which was quite easy now that we have our crossbows, leading it even closer to our rock box where it would be smashed. Needless to say, after taking all that damage, it wouldn't take much more before the mighty creature would fall before us. Your sacrifice for our survival this winter is invaluable, mighty beast, and we are grateful. Now the only thing left to do was to butcher it and begin putting its beautiful meat on our racks. As for its horns, they are worth a pretty penny, and for its leather, we decided to go about tanning it. That way we might be able to make a rug out of it, but if not, we may also end up selling it at some point as well. And sticking with our theme of filling up our meat racks, we also were going to go ahead and slaughter some of our boars that we had raised this season. But with such a successful hunt against the dare, as well as all this boar meat, I thought this might be cause for a celebration in the very near future. And that's why in just a few days we are going to be celebrating a brand new holiday, the Feast of the Rotten Boar, to celebrate all of our great expansions and our good fortune as well. We had also decided to begin trying to tame some of these ancient deer in the nearby forest as well. This ancient wildlife is large enough that we could actually ride around on them, which would be absolutely perfect for going out on trade missions. Now, to be honest with you, this isn't exactly something we want to be doing all the time. As in owners, we would prefer that our clientele only come to us to do the trading, but in times like this when winter is here and there's not really much travel through these lands, I find it okay for us to go out and do it. We didn't have all that much to trade except for plenty of hornet honey, which we've been collecting for the last few months. Now the reason being is because hornet honey is probably one of the most expensive items that we currently have at our disposal. And since it is such a hard to obtain delicacy, once we returned home, as you can see, we made a handsome profit off of it. This is the most silver that we've ever seen in our lives. And the best part? It's all ours. And by this point, as you can see, we have a plethora of wealth hidden away in our cellar. We actually have quite a bit more gems and what have you, but we just don't have them in here currently, so take my word for it. A day or so later, and it was finally time for the Feast of the Rotten Boar. A gigantic party was going to be held in the inn, and not only would our villagers, our employees, be there, but we would also have a caravan from House Oswin joining us as well. The perfect opportunity for us to sell plenty of food to them. Now, we're not stingy or anything like that, but we don't mind getting our pockets lined with a little bit of silver while the party's going on. And as the party was dwindling down to an end, everyone seemed to really have a good time. Not too shabby for our very first feast. Before today's episode ends though, I want to remind you all to please continue leaving some name suggestions for any and all characters, as well as some animals if you'd like, or just anything that you'd like to name. I really love your suggestions and I'll try to incorporate them as much as possible. This episode is actually being recorded right after the first, and thus why I haven't named anyone just yet, but we'll get around to it in the next episode. But until then, my friends, I must bid you farewell. Until next time.